The sound of crystal glasses clinking and forced laughter should have been the perfect soundtrack to our family Thanksgiving dinner. Instead, it became the moment I decided that 23 years of swallowing my pride and accepting second-class treatment from my husband's family would end tonight. As I stood in the doorway of the grand dining room at the Morrison estate, holding a tray of freshly carved turkey, my mother-in-law Margaret Morrison looked up from her place at the head of the mahogany table and delivered the words that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Oh good, the help finally arrived with the main course. I was beginning to think we'd have to serve ourselves like common people. The entire table erupted in polite chuckles, 22 pairs of eyes looking at me with that familiar mixture of amusement and disdain that had become as much a part of these gatherings as the fine china and imported wine. My name is Elena Castillo Morrison, and until that moment at the Morrison family's annual Thanksgiving celebration, I had spent over 2 decades convincing myself that love was worth the humiliation. Standing there in my carefully chosen navy dress, the one that Margaret had once deemed appropriately understated for someone of your background, I felt something inside me finally snap. But what my husband's family didn't know was that the woman they'd been treating like hired help for 23 years was actually the majority owner of Morrison Holdings, the family business empire that had sustained their lavish lifestyle for 3 generations. I was 45 years old, a first-generation Mexican-American who had worked her way through Stanford Business School while cleaning office buildings at night to pay for textbooks. My parents, Carlos and Rosa Castillo, had immigrated from Guadalajara when I was 3 years old, carrying nothing but determination and an unshakable belief that education could transform their daughter's life in ways they could barely imagine. They had sacrificed everything to give me opportunities they'd never had, working double shifts at a textile factory, while I spent my childhood buried in books and dreaming of boardrooms instead of assembly line. When I met James Morrison at a business conference in San Francisco 24 years ago, I was a 22-year-old MBA candidate, presenting research on sustainable supply chain management. He was 26, handsome in that effortless way that comes from generational wealth, and genuinely interested in the innovative logistics solutions I was proposing. James represented the 3rd generation of Morrison Holdings, a diversified conglomerate that had started as a small shipping company in the 1920s and grown into a multi-billion-dollar empire spanning logistics, real estate, and technology investment. Our courtship was a whirlwind of intellectual conversations and romantic dinners at restaurants, where I had to discreetly look up menu items I'd never heard of. James seemed fascinated by my work ethic and business acumen, often saying he'd never met anyone who could analyze market trends with such precision and passion. He spoke admiringly of my background, claiming that my perspective as someone who had worked for everything she achieved was exactly what Morrison Holdings needed to stay competitive in a changing economy. The first red flag should have been our engagement dinner, where his parents made it clear that while they approved of James's choice in a career woman, they expected that marriage would naturally lead to my focusing more on family responsibilities and less on outside pursuits. Margaret had smiled warmly while suggesting that surely I understood how important it was for Morrison wives to prioritize their roles as hostesses and community representatives over what she delicately termed professional ambition. I had nodded politely that evening, too in love and too hopeful to recognize the careful way Margaret was already defining the boundaries of my future role in their family. James had squeezed my hand under the table, and I'd interpreted his gesture as supportive solidarity rather than the apologetic acknowledgement it actually was. He knew his family's expectations and had chosen not to prepare me for the gradual erosion of respect that would characterize the next 2 decades of my life. Our wedding was everything Margaret Morrison could have designed to showcase the family's status and refinement. The ceremony took place at the Morrison estate, a sprawling compound in Marin County that had been in the family since James's grandfather struck oil in Texas and diversified into California real estate. The guest list read like a directory of San Francisco's political and business elite, with my parents and their modest circle of friends occupying a small section that felt distinctly separate from the main celebration. I should have paid more attention to the way Margaret orchestrated every detail of our wedding day, from my dress selection to the music choices, always with gentle suggestions that somehow became final decisions. She had a gift for making her preferences seem like generous offers of guidance, wrapping control in the language of experience and family tradition. When I expressed interest in incorporating some elements of my Mexican heritage into the ceremony, Margaret smiled indulgently and explained that while such touches were charming, they might confuse guests who were expecting a traditional Morrison celebration. The early years of our marriage were complicated by my determination to maintain my career trajectory and Margaret's equally strong conviction that I should embrace what she called the Morrison way of life. James had joined the family business immediately after our wedding, taking a position as Director of Strategic Development that came with a generous salary and the clear understanding that he was being groomed for eventual leadership. Meanwhile, I had accepted a position with a prestigious consulting firm, specializing in helping family businesses modernize their operations and governance structures. The irony of my professional specialty wasn't lost on me as I watched the Morrison family dynamics unfold. The company that had made their fortune was stuck in management practices that hadn't evolved since the 1960s, with decision-making concentrated in the hands of family members regardless of their qualifications or interest in the business. James's father, William Morrison, served as CEO despite having no formal business education and a tendency to make major decisions based on gut instinct rather than market analysis. Margaret controlled the family's social obligations and philanthropic activities, wielding considerable influence over business relationships through her extensive network of wives and widows connected to San Francisco's power structure. James's younger brother, Richard, held the title of Chief Financial Officer despite spending most of his time managing his art collection and planning elaborate vacations to European wine regions. During family dinners and holiday gatherings, I would listen to conversations about business challenges and missed opportunities, watching qualified solutions ignored because they came from someone who hadn't been born into the Morrison legacy. When I occasionally offered insights based on my professional experience, my suggestions were received with the kind of polite attention typically reserved for interesting but ultimately irrelevant observations from outsiders. The pattern of dismissal was subtle but consistent. My opinions were acknowledged with phrases like, "That's an interesting perspective, Elena," or "You certainly have a unique way of looking at things," followed by immediate pivots to discussing approaches that aligned with how things had always been done. James would sometimes support my ideas in private, but he never advocated for them during family meetings, leaving me to wonder whether his agreement was genuine or simply an attempt to avoid conflict at home. 3 years into our marriage, I made a decision that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Morrison family, though it would take 2 decades for them to discover what I had done. Morrison Holdings was facing a cash flow crisis due to a series of poor investment decisions and market downturns that had exposed the weaknesses in their traditional management approach. The company needed an immediate capital infusion of $50 million to avoid defaulting on major contracts and potentially losing their shipping licenses. William Morrison had exhausted traditional lending sources and was considering bringing in outside investors who would demand significant control over company operations. The family was facing the possibility of losing the controlling interest that had been their source of wealth and status for 3 generations. During a particularly tense family meeting, I listened to William and Richard debate increasingly desperate options while James sat silently, clearly uncomfortable with the trajectory of the discussion. That night, I made a proposal to James that would solve his family's financial crisis while securing our own future in ways I couldn't fully explain at the time. Using my consulting firm's connections and my own carefully accumulated savings, I arranged to purchase the debt obligations that were threatening Morrison Holdings, effectively becoming the company's primary creditor. The transaction was structured through a series of investment vehicles and legal entities that obscured my personal involvement, appearing to the Morrison family as a routine refinancing arranged by their bank. What the family didn't know was that the refinancing agreement included conversion clauses that would allow the debt holder to exchange their position for equity in Morrison Holdings under specific circumstances. Those circumstances included any attempt to remove me from family business discussions, any formal exclusion from company decision-making processes, or any action that could be interpreted as discrimination based on my ethnic background or gender. The legal documents were complex and carefully crafted by attorneys who specialized in family business succession planning. On the surface, the refinancing appeared to simply replace expensive short-term debt with more manageable long-term obligations. Buried in the fine print were provisions that would transfer 51% ownership of Morrison Holdings to me if the family ever treated me in ways that violated the dignity and respect clauses I had insisted upon. James knew about the refinancing arrangement but not about the conversion clauses or my ultimate ownership position. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I had presented the deal to him as a temporary solution that would give his family breathing room to stabilize their operations, which was true as far as it went. What I didn't explain was that I had essentially purchased insurance against the very treatment I had been experiencing since joining the family, with the power to assume control of their legacy if they continued to marginalize and dismiss me. The refinancing provided exactly the stability Morrison Holdings needed to weather their financial crisis. Within 2 years, the company had returned to profitability and the family had resumed their comfortable lifestyle of board meetings, charity galas, and extended vacations. My role in saving their business was acknowledged with perfunctory gratitude that quickly faded into the background as they returned to treating me like an auxiliary family member whose primary value lay in supporting James's career and producing the next generation of Morrison heirs. The pressure to have children became a constant undercurrent in family gatherings, with Margaret making increasingly pointed comments about the importance of continuing the Morrison lineage and my responsibility to ensure the family's genetic legacy. When James and I struggled with fertility issues, the family's disappointment was palpable, though it was always expressed through gentle questions about our plans and helpful suggestions about specialists and treatments that might address whatever deficiencies were preventing us from fulfilling our fundamental obligation. After 5 years of unsuccessful attempts to conceive, James and I made the difficult decision to pursue adoption. The process of bringing our daughter Sophia into our lives was one of the most joyful experiences we had shared. But the family's reaction was complicated by their obvious preference for biological grandchildren who would carry Morrison genes along with the Morrison name. Sophia was welcomed into the family with dutiful affection. But there was always an unspoken asterisk next to her acceptance that reminded everyone she was not truly a Morrison in the way that mattered most to people who traced their identity through bloodline. Sophia was now 20 years old, a junior at UC Berkeley studying environmental science with plans to pursue graduate work in sustainable business practice. She had inherited my analytical mind and James's easy charm, but she had also developed a keen awareness of family dynamics that sometimes worried me. During holiday gatherings, I would catch her watching the subtle ways her grandmother dismissed my contributions, or the careful manner in which her uncles redirected conversations away from topics where I might have expertise. "Mom, why do you let them treat you like that?" Sophia had asked me the previous Christmas after witnessing Margaret interrupt me mid-sentence to ask James his opinion on the exact same topic I had been discussing. The question had haunted me for months because I didn't have a satisfactory answer that didn't sound like a rationalization for accepting unacceptable behavior. The truth was that I had convinced myself that love required sacrifice, and that maintaining family harmony was worth the personal cost of swallowing my pride and expertise. I had told myself that James's career advancement within the family business was more important than my need for recognition and respect. I had rationalized that Sophia's relationship with her extended family was more valuable than modeling self-respect and professional dignity. But as I stood in that dining room on Thanksgiving 2023, holding a turkey platter while my mother-in-law made jokes about the health, I realized that 23 years of rationalization had led me to a place where my own daughter was questioning why I accepted treatment that would be unthinkable in any other context. The woman who had once commanded respect in boardrooms and conference halls had somehow allowed herself to become a supporting character in someone else's family story. The dinner conversation that evening followed the familiar pattern of Morrison family gatherings. William held court from his position at the head of the table, sharing stories about business developments and political connections that demonstrated his continued relevance in San Francisco's power circle. Richard contributed wine expertise and amusing anecdotes from his latest European adventures. James provided dutiful updates on his department's performance and strategic initiative. Margaret orchestrated the social dynamics with the skill of someone who had spent decades managing family relationships and public appearances. She directed conversation topics, managed the serving of courses, and ensured that everyone understood their role in the evening's performance of Morrison family success and harmony. When business topics arose, she would occasionally defer to the men with theatrical gestures that emphasized her traditional views about gender roles and decision-making authority. My contributions to these conversations had been limited to polite questions and supportive comments that acknowledged others' expertise without asserting my own. When asked about my consulting work, I would provide brief summaries that downplayed my achievements and focused on how my projects supported family businesses similar to Morrison Holdings. I had learned to present my professional success as an interesting hobby rather than a serious career that might compete with family obligations. But tonight felt different. As I listened to William describe the challenges facing Morrison Holdings in an increasingly competitive logistics market, I found myself silently critiquing strategies that ignored obvious technological solutions and market opportunity. When Richard complained about regulatory changes affecting their real estate investments, I recognized problems that could be addressed through diversification approaches I had successfully implemented for other clients. Most frustrating was watching James nod along with decisions that contradicted everything he had learned during his MBA program and his early years in the business. His father's reluctance to embrace data-driven decision-making was creating unnecessary risks and missed opportunities that could jeopardize the company's long-term viability. But James had learned to navigate family dynamics by deferring to his father's experience and avoiding conflicts that might threaten his position as heir apparent. During dessert service, Margaret turned the conversation to holiday traditions and family expectations for the coming year. She announced that the family would be hosting a major celebration for Morrison Holdings' centennial anniversary, an event that would showcase the company's history and the family's contributions to San Francisco's business community. The planning would require extensive coordination with vendors, venues, and guest lists that represented decades of relationship building and social positioning. Of course, Elena will be wonderful at handling the practical details, Margaret said with the kind of smile that managed to be both gracious and condescending. She's so good at organizing things and managing logistics. We'll need someone to coordinate with caterers and decorators and all those service providers who make these events possible. The assumption that I would naturally assume responsibility for the administrative aspects of the celebration while the family focused on strategic and social elements was so automatic that no one questioned it. James nodded approvingly. Richard offered helpful suggestions about wine selections, and William began discussing the guest list of prominent business leaders who should receive invitations. As I listened to the family plan an event celebrating their business acumen and entrepreneurial legacy, I realized that they had never acknowledged my role in saving that legacy from financial collapse. The refinancing that had stabilized Morrison Holdings had been forgotten as completely as if it had never happened, relegated to the category of routine business transactions that didn't require ongoing gratitude or recognition. More significantly, they continued to plan the company's future as if my expertise and insights were irrelevant to their success. Despite having worked with dozens of family businesses facing similar challenges, despite having degrees and experience that exceeded anyone else at the table, despite having literally saved their company from bankruptcy, I was still seen primarily as someone who could handle party planning and administrative tasks. The conversation continued around me as I retreated into my own thoughts, calculating the financial implications of various scenarios and considering the strategic options available to Morrison Holdings in current market conditions. I found myself mentally drafting recommendations for operational improvements and succession planning that could position the company for sustainable growth over the next decade. But I also found myself remembering the legal documents locked in my safe deposit box, the carefully crafted agreements that gave me the power to transform this family dinner conversation into something very different. For 20 years I had never seriously considered exercising the conversion clauses that would transfer controlling ownership of Morrison Holdings to me. The provisions had seemed like insurance against worst-case scenarios, rather than practical tools for addressing everyday disrespect and marginalization. Tonight, however, I began to wonder whether accepting decades of dismissive treatment had enabled behaviors that were ultimately harmful to the business and the family. My silence hadn't preserved harmony so much as it had allowed dysfunction to become entrenched and normalized. James had never learned to advocate for merit-based decision-making, because he'd never had to defend his wife's qualifications against his family's prejudices. Sophia had grown up watching her mother accept secondary status in professional discussions, learning that competence and expertise were less important than maintaining relationships and avoiding conflict. The family had become comfortable making business decisions without input from the person who had literally saved their company, creating blind spots that could prove costly in an increasingly competitive market. As the evening wound down and guests began preparing to leave, Margaret approached me with the kind of warm smile she reserved for moments when she wanted to ensure her messages had been clearly received and properly understood. "Elena, dear, I hope you understand that when I mentioned you're helping with the anniversary celebration, I meant it as a compliment," she said, placing a perfectly manicured hand on my arm. "You have such a gift for handling practical matters, and frankly the rest of us are much better at the strategic and social aspects of these events. It's wonderful how we all have different strengths that complement each other." Her words were delivered with the practiced sincerity of someone who had spent decades managing family relationships through careful attention to tone and presentation. Margaret genuinely believed that she was being gracious and appreciative, acknowledging my contributions while clarifying the boundaries of my role in family affairs. She couldn't see how her compliments about my practical abilities were actually subtle assertions about my intellectual limitations and social status. "I appreciate the opportunity to contribute," I replied, matching her tone while internally marveling at my own capacity for diplomatic responses to insults disguised as praise. "I'm sure it will be a wonderful celebration of everything the Morrison family has accomplished." As James and I drove home that evening, he seemed pleased with how the dinner had gone, commenting on the family's excitement about the anniversary celebration and their appreciation for my willingness to help with the planning. He had apparently not noticed the subtle ways his family had once again relegated me to supporting roles while positioning themselves as the strategic thinkers and decision-makers. "Mom seemed really grateful for your offer to handle the logistics," James said as we pulled into our drive. "She knows how good you are at organizing complex events, and honestly, she and Dad are much better at handling the relationship management and political aspects of something this important." His casual acceptance of his family's assumptions about my capabilities and limitations was more painful than their overt dismissiveness. James genuinely loved me, and believed he was being supportive, but he had internalized their perspective so completely that he couldn't see how their appreciation for my practical skills was actually a systematic denial of my intellectual and professional qualifications. That night, as I lay in bed reviewing the evening's conversations, I made a decision that had been building for months. Tomorrow, I would call my attorney and begin the process of activating the conversion clauses that would transfer majority ownership of Morrison Holdings to me. After 23 years of accepting secondary status in a family that owed their continued prosperity to my intervention, I was ready to claim the authority that had always been mine. The legal mechanisms were already in place, tested by 2 decades of documentation that clearly established patterns of discrimination and exclusion that violated the dignity and respect provisions in our refinancing agreement. My attorney had been updating the relevant paperwork annually, ensuring that my options remained current and enforceable if I ever decided to exercise them. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight, but it would be irreversible once initiated. Within 30 days of filing the appropriate notifications, I would legally control 51% of Morrison Holdings, giving me the authority to restructure leadership, revise strategic direction, and ensure that future business decisions reflected actual expertise rather than inherited privilege. More importantly, I would finally be able to model for Sophia what it looked like when a woman refused to accept treatment that diminished her intelligence, experience, and contribution. Instead of watching her mother swallow insults disguised as compliments, she would see someone who understood her own value and demanded that others recognize it as well. As I drifted off to sleep, I began planning the conversation I would have with the Morrison family once the legal transfer was complete. For 23 years, they had treated me like hired help who was grateful for the opportunity to serve their family's interests. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of reminding them exactly who had been helping whom all along. The irony was perfect. The family that had spent decades dismissing my business expertise was about to discover that their casual disrespect had cost them control of the business empire they had taken for granted. The woman they had treated like the help was actually the person who held their family's future in her hands. But tonight, that revelation was still my secret. Tonight, I was still Elena Castillo Morrison, the daughter-in-law who smiled politely while being insulted, who organized events while others made decisions, who possessed expertise that was acknowledged only when it could be minimized and contained. Tomorrow would begin the process of introducing them to Elena Castillo Morrison, majority owner of Morrison Holdings and the woman who would be making very different decisions about respect, recognition, and family dynamics going forward. The anticipation of that conversation was already more satisfying than 23 years of Thanksgiving dinners had ever been. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp November clarity that made San Francisco's skyline look like a postcard, but I woke up feeling like I was seeing the world through completely different eyes. As I made coffee in our Pacific Heights kitchen, surrounded by wedding gifts and family photos that suddenly felt like evidence of a life I had been performing rather than living, I realized that the decision I had made the night before was already changing how I moved through my own. James had left early for his morning run through the Presidio, a routine that gave him time to clear his head before facing whatever challenges awaited him at Morrison Holdings. He had no idea that today would bring the kind of challenge that would fundamentally alter not just his workday but the entire structure of his family's world. As I listened to his footsteps disappearing down our front steps, I felt a mixture of anticipation and sadness knowing that the man who returned from his run would be living in a very different reality than the one who had left. My first call was to Patricia Henley, the attorney who had structured the original refinancing agreement and had been maintaining the legal framework for my potential ownership conversion for over 2 decades. Patricia was one of the most respected corporate lawyers in California, specializing in complex family business transitions and succession planning that protected both financial interests and personal relationships when possible. She had understood from the beginning that my arrangement with Morrison Holdings was about more than money. It was about creating leverage that could address systemic discrimination if traditional approaches to respect and inclusion fail. "Elena, I was wondering when you would make this call," Patricia said when I reached her at 7:30 that morning. "The documentation you sent me after last night's dinner was quite thorough. The pattern of exclusion and dismissive treatment is even clearer now than it was when we first established the conversion clause." For years I had been sending Patricia detailed summaries of family meetings, business discussions, and social interactions that demonstrated the Morrison family's consistent treatment of me as someone whose opinions and expertise were irrelevant to their decision-making processes. The documentation had been Patricia's suggestion, creating a comprehensive record that would support the dignity and respect provisions if I ever chose to exercise my ownership rights. "I want to move forward with the conversion," I told her, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. 23 years is long enough to wait for voluntary change that clearly isn't coming. Patricia's response was immediate and practical. She had been preparing for this possibility for decades, updating legal documents and ensuring that the conversion process would be swift and irreversible once initiated. The original refinancing agreement had been structured to anticipate exactly this scenario, with built-in protections that would prevent the Morrison family from challenging the ownership transfer or claiming they had been deceived about the terms of their financial arrangement. "The process will take approximately 30 days from filing to completion," Patricia explained. "During that time, the current leadership structure will remain in place, but they'll be notified that a major ownership transition is pending. Once the conversion is finalized, you'll have legal authority to restructure management, revise strategic direction, and implement whatever governance changes you deem appropriate." The timeline felt both impossibly long and frighteningly short. 30 days to completely transform family relationships that had been calcified for over 2 decades. 30 days to prepare for conversations that would shatter every assumption the Morrison family had made about power, control, and their place in the business empire that defined their identity. "What kind of initial reaction should I expect?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Patricia's laugh was dry and knowing. In my experience, families in this situation go through predictable stages. Initial denial that the legal documents mean what they clearly state, anger about being deceived or manipulated, desperate attempts to negotiate or find loopholes. Eventually, most people reach some form of acceptance, but the journey can be quite turbulent. After finishing my call with Patricia, I spent an hour reviewing financial documents and strategic analyses that I had been preparing for Morrison Holdings over the past several years. As a consultant specializing in family business transitions, I had been quietly developing recommendations for operational improvements and succession planning that could position the company for sustainable growth in an increasingly competitive market. The irony of my situation was profound. While the Morrison family had been treating me like someone whose business insights were irrelevant to their success, I had been developing solutions to problems they didn't even realize they were facing. Their resistance to data-driven decision-making and modern governance practices was creating vulnerabilities that could prove catastrophic if not addressed within the next few years. The logistics industry was experiencing rapid technological disruption that required significant capital investments and strategic partnerships to remain competitive. Morrison Holdings' traditional approach of relying on established relationships and proven methods was becoming a liability in a market where efficiency and innovation determined survival. Meanwhile, their real estate portfolio was concentrated in markets that were vulnerable to economic fluctuations and regulatory changes that could dramatically impact valuation. Most concerning was their complete lack of succession planning, beyond the assumption that James would eventually inherit leadership responsibilities regardless of his qualifications or interest in the role. At 47, James had never been given the authority to implement significant changes or develop his own vision for the company's future. He remained essentially a senior employee in a business that would theoretically become his responsibility without any preparation for the strategic thinking and decision-making that effective leadership would require. As I reviewed these analyses, I realized that my conversion to majority ownership wasn't just about demanding personal respect. It was about preventing a business collapse that would devastate not only the Morrison family but also the hundreds of employees whose livelihoods depended on the company's continued success. The family's casual dismissal of my expertise wasn't just personally insulting, it was professionally irresponsible in ways that could have far-reaching consequences. James returned from his run at 9 o'clock, looking relaxed and energized in the way that morning exercise always left him. He kissed me good morning and began preparing for his day at the office, chatting about weekend plans and upcoming family obligations, while I watched him move through routines that would never feel the same once he learned what was about to happen. "Mom called this morning," James mentioned as he adjusted his tie. "She wanted to make sure you understood how much the family appreciates your willingness to help with the anniversary celebration. She's already started making lists of vendors and venues that will need coordination." The casual assumption that I had agreed to handle party planning logistics rather than participating in strategic celebration planning was exactly the kind of subtle marginalization that had been normalized over decades of similar interaction. Margaret's gratitude was genuine, but it was gratitude for my willingness to accept a subordinate role rather than recognition of my potential contributions to meaningful aspects of the event. "I've been thinking about the anniversary celebration differently," I said carefully, testing how James would respond to the suggestion that my involvement might extend beyond administrative tasks. Given Morrison Holdings' current market position, this could be an opportunity to showcase strategic innovations and future vision rather than just celebrating historical achievement. James paused in his morning routine, considering my suggestion with the kind of polite attention he had learned to show when I offered business insights that might conflict with family expectations. "That's an interesting idea," he said after a moment, "though I think Mom and Dad are really focused on highlighting the company's legacy and the family's contributions to San Francisco's business community." His response was diplomatic but dismissive, acknowledging my perspective while indicating that it wasn't aligned with the family's priority. The fact that my suggestion might actually serve the company's interests better than their traditional approach wasn't considered relevant to the decision-making process. Family preferences trumped strategic considerations, just as they had for decades. After James left for work, I called Sophia at Berkeley to let her know about the changes that would be affecting our family over the next few weeks. At 20 years old, Sophia had developed sophisticated insights into family dynamics and business relationships that often surprised me with their accuracy and maturity. She had watched the Morrison family's treatment of me with increasing frustration over the years, frequently asking why I didn't assert myself more forcefully in situations where my expertise was being ignored or dismissed. "Mom, are you finally going to tell them about the ownership thing?" Sophia asked immediately, as if she had been expecting this conversation for years. Her question caught me off guard. I had never explicitly discussed my legal position with Sophia, though I had occasionally mentioned that our family's financial security didn't depend entirely on James's position within Morrison Holdings. Apparently, my careful references to diversified investments and independent assets had been transparent enough for Sophia to understand that our relationship with the Morrison business empire was more complex than it appeared. "How much do you know about the ownership situation?" I asked, curious about what she had pieced together from overheard conversations and careful observation. Sophia's response revealed that she had inherited my analytical abilities along with a keen understanding of power dynamics that came from growing up as an adopted daughter in a family that valued genetic inheritance above all other consideration. She had been watching the Morrison family's decision-making processes, with the perspective of someone who understood that inclusion was conditional and that respect had to be earned repeatedly rather than assumed automatically. "I know that you saved their business 20 years ago when they were about to lose everything," Sophia said matter-of-factly. "I know that you structured the deal in a way that protected our family's interests if they ever treated you badly enough to trigger certain consequences. And I know that 23 years of treating you like party planning staff while ignoring your actual qualifications probably qualifies as bad enough." Her summary was more accurate than I had expected, reflecting both intelligence and attention to detail that reminded me why I was so proud of the young woman she had become. Sophia had been watching our family navigate complex relationships and business obligations while developing her own understanding of how power, respect, and financial control intersected in ways that could either protect or devastate the people involved. "How do you feel about the family dynamics changing dramatically over the next few weeks?" I asked, wanting to ensure that she was prepared for the emotional complexity of watching her father's family lose control of the business that had defined their identity for 3 generations. Sophia's response was immediate and clear. "I feel relieved," she said without hesitation. "I've been watching them dismiss you and undervalue your contributions for my entire life. It's been painful to see someone as smart and capable as you accept treatment that would be unacceptable in any other context. I'm proud that you're finally going to claim the respect and authority you've always deserved." Her support was both gratifying and humbling. I had spent years worrying that asserting my rights would damage Sophia's relationship with her extended family or create conflicts that would affect her sense of belonging and security. Instead, she had been waiting for me to demonstrate the kind of self-respect and professional dignity that I had been teaching her to expect in her own life. The rest of the morning was spent preparing for conversations that would fundamentally alter every relationship in our extended family. I reviewed legal documents, financial projections, and strategic recommendations, while mentally rehearsing explanations for decisions that would seem sudden and dramatic to people who had never understood the gradual accumulation of insults and dismissals that had led to this moment. Patricia called at noon to confirm that the initial legal notifications had been filed and that the 30-day conversion process was officially underway. Morrison Holdings Board of Directors and senior management would receive formal notice that afternoon, though the specific details of the ownership transfer would be revealed gradually as the legal requirements demand. "The notification will indicate that a major ownership transition is pending but won't immediately identify you as the new majority owner," Patricia explained. "That gives you time to prepare your approach to the family conversations while ensuring that the legal process can't be disrupted by emotional reactions or attempts at negotiation." The afternoon brought a flurry of phone calls from family members who had received the initial notifications and were confused about what the legal documents meant for Morrison Holdings' future. William called first, his voice tight with concern as he asked whether I knew anything about pending ownership changes that could affect family control of the business. "Elena, we've received some legal notifications that suggest someone is exercising conversion rights related to our refinancing agreements from 20 years ago." William said, clearly hoping I might have insights that could help him understand what was happening. The lawyers are reviewing everything, but frankly most of us had forgotten about the specific terms of those arrangements. His assumption that I might have forgotten about the financial agreement that had saved his business from bankruptcy was typical of the family's ability to minimize and dismiss contributions that didn't align with their preferred narrative about Morrison Holdings' success. The idea that I might be intimately familiar with every clause and provision of those arrangements apparently hadn't occurred to him. The legal documents should explain the process and timeline, I said carefully, maintaining the diplomatic tone that had become automatic after decades of managing family relationships. I'm sure your attorneys will be able to clarify whatever questions arise. William's frustration was palpable as he realized that I wasn't going to provide the kind of helpful insights he had been expecting. Well, if you hear anything from your consulting contacts about who might be behind this ownership situation, please let us know immediately. We need to understand what we're dealing with before making any strategic decisions. The irony of his request was almost overwhelming. The man who had spent 23 years dismissing my business expertise was now asking me to use my professional network to help him understand a legal situation that I had created specifically to address his family's treatment of me. The fact that his first instinct was to seek my help rather than recognize my potential involvement revealed how completely he had compartmentalized my capabilities into areas that served his interests while remaining irrelevant to serious business matters. Margaret called an hour later, her voice filled with the kind of anxious energy that always emerged when family stability was threatened by circumstances beyond her control. As someone who had spent decades managing Morrison family relationships and social positioning, she understood better than her husband how ownership changes could affect not just business operations, but also their standing within San Francisco's interconnected network of wealthy families. Elena, dear, I'm hoping you might have some insights about this ownership situation that's developing, Margaret said, her tone carefully modulated to convey both concern and confidence in my discretion. William is convinced it's some kind of hostile takeover attempt, but I keep thinking it might be related to estate planning or succession issues that we haven't been informed about properly. Her speculation revealed how little the family understood about their own business structure and the legal arrangements that had been sustaining their lifestyle for 2 decades. The possibility that I might be personally involved in the ownership transition was so far outside their conception of my role and capabilities that they were developing elaborate theories about external threats rather than considering internal reality. Legal matters can be quite complex, I replied diplomatically. I'm sure the attorneys will be able to provide clarity about the specific processes and timelines involved. Margaret's response suggested that she was beginning to sense something in my tone that indicated deeper knowledge than my words were revealing. Elena, you would tell us if you knew something that could help the family navigate this situation, wouldn't you? We've always been able to count on your loyalty and discretion during difficult times. Her appeal to family loyalty was particularly ironic given that the ownership conversion was directly triggered by decades of treatment that had demonstrated how conditional their concept of family loyalty actually was. The respect and inclusion that should have been automatic aspects of family membership had been consistently withheld from me while expectations for my support and discretion had remained absolute. James called in the late afternoon, his voice tight with stress as he described the chaos that had erupted at Morrison Holdings after the legal notifications arrived. Board meetings had been called, emergency consultations with attorneys had been scheduled, and family members were demanding explanations for developments that no one seemed to understand. Elena, this is turning into a complete disaster, James said, his frustration evident as he described the family's growing panic about losing control of the business that had defined their identity for 3 generations. Dad is convinced that someone has been planning this takeover for years, and Mom is worried about what this means for our social relationships and community standing. The family's reaction was exactly what Patricia had predicted, but hearing James describe their confusion and fear was more painful than I had anticipated. These were people I had lived with and cared about for over 2 decades, despite their limitations and prejudices. Watching them face the consequences of their behavior was satisfying in principle but difficult in practice. What kind of timeline are the lawyers projecting for resolving the ownership question? I asked, maintaining my role as a concerned family member rather than revealing my position as the person orchestrating the entire process. James's response revealed how little he understood about the legal mechanisms that were already in motion. They're saying it could take weeks or even months to sort out, depending on how complex the original agreements were and whether the people involved are willing to negotiate. The whole thing is making everyone incredibly anxious about what the future holds. That evening, I prepared dinner while mentally rehearsing the conversation I would have with James once the 30-day legal process was complete and my majority ownership was officially established. The kitchen, where we had shared thousands of meals and conversations, was about to become the setting for a discussion that would change everything about our marriage, our family relationships, and our shared future. The anticipation was both exhilarating and terrifying. For 23 years, I had been the accommodating daughter-in-law who smiled through insults and accepted secondary status in family business discussion. In 30 days, I would be the majority owner of Morrison Holdings, with the legal authority to restructure leadership, revise strategic direction, and ensure that future family interactions reflected actual respect rather than performative politeness. Sophia called that evening to check on how the first day of the legal process had unfolded. Her excitement about the family's impending discovery was infectious, but she also understood the emotional complexity of transforming relationships that had been built on fundamentally unequal foundation. "Mom, how are you feeling about watching them panic about something you've been planning for 20 years?" Sophia asked with the kind of directness that reminded me how much I admired her emotional intelligence and moral clarity. "Complicated," I admitted. "Part of me feels vindicated that they're finally going to understand what real consequences look like. But part of me feels sad that it took legal coercion to get to a place where my expertise and contributions might be valued appropriately." Sophia's response was characteristically insightful. "Maybe the sadness is about grieving the relationships you thought you had, rather than regretting the relationships you're creating," she suggested. "They had 23 years to treat you with respect voluntarily. Now they get to learn what respect looks like when it's required rather than requested." As I went to bed that night, I reflected on how dramatically my life was about to change over the next month. The woman who had spent decades accepting diminished status in a family that owed their prosperity to her intervention was about to claim the authority and recognition that had always been rightfully hers. Tomorrow would bring more confused phone calls from family members who couldn't understand what was happening to their carefully controlled world. More emergency meetings where they would develop theories about external threats while remaining blind to internal reality. More desperate attempts to maintain control over a situation that had already moved beyond their influence. But in 30 days, those phone calls would have a very different character. Instead of asking for my insights about mysterious ownership changes, they would be asking for my decisions about the company's future. Instead of assuming my role as party planning coordinator, they would be discovering my role as majority owner with the authority to determine who participated in strategic discussions and how family business relationships would be structured going forward. The transformation wouldn't just affect business operations and family dynamics. It would also model for Sophia what it looked like when a woman refused to accept treatment that diminished her intelligence, experience, and contribution. Instead of watching her mother smile through insults disguised as compliments, she would see someone who understood her own value and demanded that others recognize it appropriately. The anticipation of those conversations was already more satisfying than 23 years of diplomatic responses to casual dismissal had ever been. But more importantly, the impending ownership conversion represented the beginning of authentic relationships, based on mutual respect rather than performative harmony maintained through one person's systematic self-diminishment. As I drifted off to sleep, I began planning the strategic improvements I would implement once my legal authority was established. Morrison Holdings needed modernization, diversification, and succession planning that reflected actual qualifications, rather than inherited expectations. The company could thrive under competent leadership that valued data-driven decision-making and innovative approaches to market challenges. For the first time in decades, I was genuinely excited about the future rather than simply enduring the present. The woman who had been treated like hired help was about to remind her in-laws exactly who had been helping whom all along. 28 days into the conversion process, Patricia called with news that would accelerate everything I had been planning. The Morrison family's attorneys had finally decoded the ownership transfer documents and discovered that Elena Castillo Morrison was the mysterious party acquiring majority control of their business empire. The revelation had triggered emergency family meetings, frantic calls to financial advisors, and desperate attempts to find legal loopholes that could prevent the transfer from completing. "They know it's you," Patricia said without preamble when I answered her call that Tuesday morning. William Morrison's attorney called my office this morning demanding an immediate meeting to discuss what he termed irregularities in the original refinancing agreement. I told him that all documentation had been properly filed and executed according to standard legal procedures, but he seemed convinced that some kind of fraud or deception must be involved. The accusation of fraud was particularly ironic given that the Morrison family had been the beneficiaries of my intervention for 2 decades. The suggestion that I had somehow deceived them by saving their business while protecting my own interest revealed how completely they had misunderstood the nature of our financial relationship. In their minds, my role was to provide solutions that served their interest without considering my own position or future security. "What kind of timeline are we looking at for completing the transfer?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would accelerate my plans for the family confrontation. Patricia's response confirmed my expectations. "Given their knowledge of your involvement, I recommend we expedite the final documentation. The conversion can be completed by Friday if you're ready to assume active control of Morrison Holdings immediately rather than waiting for the full 30-day period." The prospect of becoming majority owner within 3 days was both thrilling and terrifying. For weeks, I had been mentally preparing for gradual revelation and carefully orchestrated conversations that would ease the family into understanding their new reality. Now I would need to be ready for immediate confrontation with people who felt betrayed and deceived rather than grateful for decades of financial stability I had provided. James had been increasingly agitated as the ownership mystery deepened, spending long hours at the office participating in strategy sessions aimed at identifying the anonymous party threatening their family control. He came home each evening exhausted and frustrated, describing the growing tension among family members, who were beginning to blame each other for whatever circumstances had created their vulnerability to external acquisition. "Dad is convinced that someone leaked confidential information to potential buyers," James told me over dinner Tuesday night, his voice tight with stress and confusion. "Richard thinks it might be related to some old business dispute that's finally catching up with us. Mom is worried that our social relationships have created enemies who are using financial leverage for revenge." The family's theories about external threats revealed how impossible it was for them to imagine that the threat to their control might come from within their own household. The idea that I might possess the knowledge, resources, and motivation to orchestrate such a comprehensive acquisition was so far outside their conception of my capabilities that they were developing increasingly elaborate explanations rather than considering the obvious solution to their mystery. "Have the lawyers able to provide any clarity about the timeline or the buyer's intentions?" I asked, maintaining my role as a concerned family member while gathering intelligence about their strategic responses. James's answer revealed the depth of their panic and the complete absence of contingency planning for scenarios where their control might be challenged. "They're saying we could know as early as this week, but they're also warning us that hostile takeovers often involve immediate leadership changes and operational restructuring that could affect everyone's position in the company." The possibility that James might lose his executive role had never occurred to him during 2 decades of assuming that his inheritance was guaranteed regardless of his performance or qualifications. The prospect of facing actual accountability for business results was clearly causing anxiety that went far beyond concerns about salary or status. His entire identity was built around being the heir apparent to Morrison Holdings, and he had never developed professional confidence independent of that inherited expectation. Wednesday morning brought a call from Margaret that revealed how the family's anxiety was affecting their ability to maintain the social facade that had always been central to their public identity. Her voice was strained and uncertain in ways I had never heard before, suggesting that the potential loss of business control was threatening foundations of security that went far beyond financial consideration. "Lena, dear, I need to ask you something directly," Margaret said, her carefully cultivated composure cracking slightly around the edges. "William's attorneys have suggested that the ownership transfer might involve someone with inside knowledge of our family's business arrangement. They're asking whether any of us might have inadvertently shared confidential information with people who could use it against our interests." Her question was a careful attempt to determine whether I might have been the source of information that enabled an external party to structure their acquisition strategy. The possibility that I might be the external party apparently remained unthinkable, but the family was beginning to recognize that their vulnerability suggested intimate familiarity with their financial structure and legal obligation. "I'm not aware of any information sharing that would compromise the family's business interests," I replied truthfully, since my knowledge came from being a direct party to the original agreements rather than from inappropriate disclosure of confidential detail. Margaret's response revealed her growing desperation to maintain control over a situation that was rapidly moving beyond her ability to manage through traditional social and family relationship strategies. "Elena, if you have any insights about how we might approach whoever is behind this acquisition, we would be enormously grateful for your guidance. You understand business negotiations and legal complexities in ways that could be invaluable during this crisis." The irony of her request was staggering. After 23 years of treating my business expertise as irrelevant to serious family discussions, Margaret was now asking me to use that same expertise to help them defend against a threat I had created specifically to address their dismissive treatment. The fact that she still couldn't imagine me as a principal rather than an advisor revealed how deeply ingrained their assumptions about my role and capabilities had become. Thursday brought news that the Morrison family had scheduled an emergency board meeting for Friday afternoon to address the impending ownership transfer and develop response strategies for whatever demands the new majority owner might make. James was particularly anxious about the meeting, since his position as heir apparent would be among the first targets if the acquisition involved leadership restructuring aimed at improving operational efficiency. "Elena, I might need to prepare for the possibility that everything changes after tomorrow's meeting," James said Thursday evening, his voice carrying a vulnerability I hadn't heard since the early years of our marriage. "If this new owner decides to bring in outside management or restructure family involvement in the business, I could be looking for a new job by next week." His fear was genuine and heartbreaking, even though it was based on assumptions about my intentions that were completely inaccurate. I had no plans to eliminate James from Morrison Holdings, but I was absolutely planning to ensure that his continued involvement would be based on merit and performance rather than inherited entitlement. The leadership restructuring I envisioned would create accountability and professional development opportunities that could actually enhance his career prospects if he was willing to embrace them. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we'll face it together," I assured him, meaning the words more literally than he could possibly understand. Friday morning arrived with the kind of gray San Francisco weather that seemed appropriate for a day that would fundamentally alter the Morrison family's understanding of power, control, and respect. I dressed carefully in a charcoal business suit that projected authority without appearing threatening, knowing that my appearance at the board meeting would need to establish immediate credibility with people who had never seen me as anything other than James's accommodating wife. Patricia called at 9 o'clock to confirm that all final documentation had been completed, and that my majority ownership of Morrison Holdings was now legally established and irrevocable. The 23-year-old refinancing agreement had served its purpose perfectly, transforming from a financial lifeline into a mechanism for transferring power from people who had taken it for granted to someone who understood its responsibilities and potential. "Elena, as of this morning, you control 51% of Morrison Holdings with full authority to restructure management, revise strategic direction, and implement whatever governance changes you deem appropriate," Patricia said, her voice carrying satisfaction at seeing decades of careful legal preparation come to fruition. "The family's emergency board meeting this afternoon will be your first opportunity to exercise that authority publicly." The finality of her words was both exhilarating and sobering. After decades of accepting secondary status in family business discussions, I was now the person with ultimate decision-making authority over Morrison Holdings' future. The woman they had treated like party planning staff would be chairing board meetings and determining strategic priorities that could affect hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in assets. I spent the morning reviewing strategic recommendations I had been developing for Morrison Holdings over the past several years, preparing to present solutions to problems the family had been ignoring while they focused on maintaining traditional approaches to business management. The company needed modernization, diversification, and succession planning that reflected actual qualifications rather than inherited expectations, and I was finally in a position to implement changes that could ensure long-term viability and growth. At 1 o'clock, I drove to Morrison Holdings' corporate headquarters in the financial district, parking in the executive garage where I had attended countless family events and social gatherings but never in my capacity as a business owner. The building's marble lobby and mahogany-paneled elevators suddenly felt different when I was entering as the majority owner rather than as James's wife accompanying him to routine meetings. The boardroom was exactly as I remembered from previous family gatherings, with its massive conference table, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking San Francisco Bay, and portraits of Morrison family patriarchs dating back to the company's founding in the 90s. What was different was my position at the table, where I took the seat that had been reserved for the majority owner rather than the observer chair I had occupied during previous meetings. William Morrison entered the room at precisely 2 o'clock, followed by Richard, James, and 3 external board members who had been recruited to provide independent oversight of family business operations. Their expressions ranged from confused to apprehensive as they noticed my presence at the head of the table, clearly uncertain about why I was participating in a meeting called to address threats to family control of the business. "Elena, I wasn't expecting you to join us today," William said carefully, his tone suggesting both surprise and slight irritation at what he apparently interpreted as inappropriate attendance at a serious business meeting. "This discussion involves confidential strategic issues that typically require board-level clearance for participation." His assumption that I was attending inappropriately was exactly the kind of dismissive response I had been experiencing for 23 years. But today it would be the last time he would be in a position to question my presence at Morrison Holdings' business meeting. The irony of his concern about confidentiality and clearance was perfect, given that he was addressing the person who now had ultimate authority over what information was shared and who was authorized to participate in company discussion. "William, I appreciate your concern about proper procedures," I replied, maintaining the diplomatic tone that had become automatic while internally savoring the moment I had been anticipating for decades. "I'm here today because circumstances have changed in ways that affect everyone's understanding of governance and decision-making authority within Morrison Holdings." James looked confused by my formal tone and uncertain about why I was speaking as if I had independent authority rather than simply accompanying him to provide moral support during a difficult family meeting. Richard appeared irritated by what he interpreted as an inappropriate assertion of influence by someone whose role should be limited to supporting family members rather than participating in strategic discussion. Margaret entered the room at that moment, immediately noticing the tension and my position at the head of the table. Her carefully maintained composure faltered slightly as she processed the implications of my presence in what was clearly a position of authority rather than support. "Elena, dear, I think there may be some confusion about today's meeting agenda," Margaret said, her voice carrying the kind of gentle correction she had perfected for managing social situations where people misunderstood their appropriate role. "This is a confidential board session focused on addressing external threats to family control of the business." Her reference to external threats was ironic beyond measure, given that she was addressing the person who represented the most significant change to family control in Morrison Holdings' century-long history. The external threat they had been desperately trying to identify and neutralize was sitting at the head of their conference table, wearing a business suit and holding legal documents that transferred ultimate decision-making authority away from the Morrison family. "Margaret, I understand the meeting's purpose," I replied, beginning to enjoy the confusion and growing anxiety that was becoming apparent in their body language and tone. "In fact, I'm here today to provide clarity about the ownership transition that has been causing so much concern over the past month." William's response was immediate and sharp. "Elena, If you have information about the party attempting to acquire control of Morrison Holdings, we need that information immediately. Our attorneys are prepared to pursue every legal option to prevent this takeover from proceeding. The desperation in his voice was palpable as he realized that their family's three-generation control over the business empire that defined their identity and social status was slipping away despite their attempts to identify and negotiate with whoever was threatening their position. The possibility that those legal options might be irrelevant because the acquisition was already complete apparently hadn't occurred to him. "William, the ownership transition is already complete," I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority that comes from holding irrevocable legal power over people who had taken that power for granted. "As of this morning, I am the majority owner of Morrison Holdings with full control over company operations, strategic direction, and leadership structure." The silence that followed my announcement was profound and lasting. James stared at me with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language that he couldn't possibly understand. Richard's face went through a series of expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief to anger, as he processed the implications of what I had just revealed. William's reaction was the most dramatic, his face flushing red, as he struggled to comprehend how the accommodating daughter-in-law who had been providing party planning services had somehow acquired control over the business empire his family had controlled for 3 generations. Margaret appeared frozen in place, her usual social grace completely abandoned as she grappled with a situation that was so far outside her experience that she had no practiced responses available. "That's impossible," William finally managed, his voice strained and uncertain. "You don't have the resources or the access to acquire majority ownership of Morrison Holdings. Someone would have had to provide you with confidential financial information and legal documentation that you couldn't possibly have obtained independently." His assumption that I lacked the resources and knowledge to orchestrate such an acquisition was typical of the family's systematic underestimation of my capabilities, but it also revealed how completely they had forgotten the circumstances that had enabled their continued prosperity for the past 2 decades. The refinancing agreement that had saved Morrison Holdings from bankruptcy had been structured specifically to create the leverage I was now exercising. "William, I didn't acquire majority ownership," I explained patiently, opening the legal folder I had brought to the meeting. "I converted existing financial positions that have been in place since the refinancing agreement that saved Morrison Holdings from bankruptcy 23 years ago. The ownership transfer was triggered by documented patterns of discrimination and exclusion that violated the dignity and respect provisions included in that original agreement." James found his voice at that moment, though it was strained and confused in ways that broke my heart even as I felt vindicated by the family's shocked recognition of realities they had been ignoring for decades. "Elena, what are you talking about? What refinancing agreement? What dignity and respect provisions?" His questions revealed how little he understood about the financial arrangements that had been sustaining his family's lifestyle and business operations since shortly after our marriage. The fact that he had never been informed about the specific terms and conditions that governed their access to capital suggested that his parents had considered him irrelevant to serious business discussion, just as they had considered me irrelevant despite my professional expertise and direct involvement in their financial stability. "James, when Morrison Holdings was facing bankruptcy in 2001, I arranged the refinancing that provided the capital injection needed to save the company," I explained, watching his face as he processed information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his family's business history. "The agreement included provisions that would transfer majority ownership to me if the family ever treated me in ways that violated basic standards of respect and inclusion." "You're claiming that you deliberately deceived our family about the terms of a financial agreement and then manipulated us into behavior that would trigger ownership transfer? That sounds like fraud, and will pursue every legal remedy available to reverse this manipulation." His accusation of manipulation was particularly ironic, given that the behavior triggering the ownership transfer had been the Morrison family's choice to consistently treat me as if my business expertise was irrelevant to their decision-making process. The idea that I had manipulated them into 23 years of dismissive treatment required a level of strategic planning that would have been impossible to sustain while maintaining genuine relationships and family harmony. The dignity and respect provisions were clearly outlined in the original refinancing documents that your father signed, maintaining my composure while internally marveling at his ability to characterize my response to their behavior as manipulation rather than acknowledging the behavior itself as problem. Your family's attorneys reviewed those documents extensively before execution, and the conversion clauses were specifically designed to protect against exactly the kind of treatment I've been experiencing for 2 decades. Margaret finally found her voice, though it was strained and uncertain in ways that revealed how completely this revelation had shattered her assumptions about family relationships and power dynamics. Elena, I don't understand how you could have been planning this deception for so many years while acting like a loyal family member. Everything about our relationship has been built on lies and manipulation. Her characterization of our relationship as built on lies was breathtaking in its reversal of responsibility. The woman who had spent 23 years making jokes about the help while systematically excluding me from meaningful business discussions was now claiming that my response to that treatment constituted deception and manipulation. The fact that I had continued to fulfill family obligations and maintain social harmony despite their consistent dismissiveness was apparently evidence of duplicity rather than remarkable patience and loyalty. Margaret, I have been a loyal family member for 23 years, I said, my voice carrying decades of accumulated frustration and disappointment. I arranged the refinancing that saved your family's business. I participated in social obligations and family events while accepting secondary status in conversations where my expertise was directly relevant. I organized parties and managed logistics while watching qualified solutions to business problems be ignored, because they came from someone you considered irrelevant to serious discussions. William's face was now pale as he began to understand the full implications of what had been revealed. The emergency board meeting called to address external threats to family control had become the moment when an internal family member revealed that the control had already been transferred through legal mechanisms that had been in place for decades. Elena, if what you're saying is true, then you've been in a position to destroy our family's business for 20 years, William said, his voice carrying a mixture of fear and grudging respect for the strategic patience that such a position would have required. Why are you exercising this authority now instead of when the original agreement was established? His question was the first indication that any family member was beginning to understand the remarkable restraint I had shown in allowing them to maintain control while consistently treating me as if my contributions were irrelevant to their success. The fact that I had waited 23 years to exercise ownership rights that had been legally established since 2001 suggested that my intentions were focused on demanding respect rather than pursuing revenge. William, I exercised this authority now because 23 years of hoping for voluntary change was long enough, I replied, opening my strategic planning folder to reveal documents that would reshape Morrison Holdings' future operation. The company needs modernization, diversification, and succession planning that reflects actual qualifications rather than inherited expectations. The systematic exclusion of qualified perspectives from business discussions has created vulnerabilities that could prove catastrophic if not addressed immediately. James was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time, his expression revealing the cognitive dissonance of realizing that the woman he had been married to for 24 years possessed capabilities and strategic thinking abilities that his family had never acknowledged or respected. The disconnect between the party planning coordinator they had been interacting with and the majority business owner sitting at the head of their conference table was apparently too dramatic for immediate comprehension. Elena, what does this mean for our marriage? James asked quietly, his voice carrying genuine fear about how this revelation would affect not just his career prospects but also his personal relationships and family stability. His question revealed that he was beginning to understand that the power dynamics that had defined our marriage for 2 decades had been fundamentally altered in ways that would require complete renegotiation of expectations, roles, and mutual respect. The woman who had been accepting secondary status in family discussions was now the person with ultimate authority over his professional future and his family's financial security. Jane, what this means for our marriage depends on whether you're capable of respecting the woman you married rather than the diminished version your family preferred, I replied, watching his face as he processed the choice between personal growth and family loyalty that my revelation was forcing him to confront. The room fell silent again as everyone absorbed the full implications of the conversation. The Morrison family's emergency board meeting to address external threats had become a reckoning with internal realities that none of them had been prepared to face. The woman they had treated like hired help for 23 years was now explaining how their casual disrespect had cost them control of the business empire that had defined their identity for 3 generations. Margaret was the first to break the silence, her voice small and uncertain as she grappled with the complete reversal of family power dynamics. Elena, what do you want from us now? What are your intentions for Morrison Holdings and for our family relationship? Her question was the beginning of a conversation that would determine whether the Morrison family could learn to function with mutual respect rather than inherited hierarchy. The next chapter of their family story would depend on their ability to recognize my expertise and contributions as valuable assets rather than threats to their traditional way of managing business and personal relations. Margaret, what I want is very simple, I replied, looking around the table at faces that were beginning to show genuine curiosity rather than just shock and defensiveness. I want Morrison Holdings to thrive under competent leadership that values innovation and data-driven decision-making. I want family relationships based on mutual respect rather than inherited status. And I want Sophia to see what it looks like when a woman demands the recognition her intelligence and contributions deserve. The strategic recommendations I presented over the next hour outlined a vision for Morrison Holdings that could position the company for sustainable growth while creating opportunities for family members who were willing to earn their positions through merit rather than inheritance. James would have the chance to develop real leadership skills and business expertise. Richard could contribute his artistic sensibilities to marketing and brand development if he was willing to approach it professionally. Even William and Margaret could play valuable advisory roles if they were willing to acknowledge that effective governance required diverse perspectives and qualified input. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight, but it would begin immediately with my authority to restructure leadership and implement changes that had been needed for decades. The woman who had been excluded from meaningful business discussions would now be chairing board meetings and determining strategic priorities that could affect hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in assets. As the meeting concluded and family members filed out in various states of shock and contemplation, James remained behind to process what had just happened to his understanding of our marriage, his family, and his professional future. Elena, I need to understand something, James said once we were alone in the boardroom that would now be the site of my executive meetings rather than his family's exclusive discussions. How long have you been planning this confrontation? His question revealed that he was still thinking in terms of manipulation and deception rather than recognizing that his family's behavior had created the circumstances that triggered my ownership conversion. The idea that I had been responding to their treatment rather than orchestrating it was apparently difficult for him to accept. James, I wasn't planning a confrontation, I replied honestly. I was planning protection. The ownership conversion was designed as insurance against exactly the kind of treatment I've been experiencing for 23 years. The confrontation became necessary when it became clear that voluntary respect wasn't forthcoming. Over the following weeks, the Morrison family began the difficult process of adjusting to new realities that required fundamental changes in how they thought about authority, expertise and family relationships. Some members adapted better than others, with Sophia providing enthusiastic support for changes that she had been hoping to see for years. The business improvements I implemented were both immediate and dramatic. Morrison Holdings' adoption of modern management practices and strategic planning processes resulted in operational efficiencies that increased profitability within the first quarter. The succession planning I developed created clear pathways for family members to earn leadership positions through demonstrated competence rather than inherited entitlement. Most importantly, the transformation provided a model for other family businesses struggling with similar issues of discrimination and exclusion. The Morrison case became a template for how protective legal structures could address systemic problems that traditional approaches to family harmony had been unable to resolve. 6 months after the boardroom revelation, I stood at the podium of the National Association of Family Business Annual Conference, sharing the story of how legal preparation and strategic patience had transformed both a business and a family. The audience included hundreds of women who had been experiencing similar marginalization in their own family enterprises, many of whom had never considered that protective measures could be implemented to address discrimination that was often disguised as tradition and family harmony. The woman who had been treated like hired help had become a nationally recognized expert on family business governance and succession planning. The trust fund that had been designed to protect one family's assets had inspired legal structures that could protect thousands of women from similar discrimination and exclusion. But perhaps most satisfying was watching Sophia begin her own career with confidence that her intelligence and contributions would be valued appropriately rather than dismissed or marginal. The transformation that had begun with a Thanksgiving dinner insult had created a legacy of respect and recognition that would benefit generations of women who refused to accept secondary status in families and businesses where they deserved equal voice and authority. The Morrison family's story became a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response to systematic disrespect is patient preparation, combined with strategic action when voluntary change proves impossible. The woman they had called the help had been helping herself to the authority and recognition she had always deserved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.